So 2 Kings, we are in chapter 21, looking at the two evil kings. And we just kind of barely got into chapter 21 last week, and we were able to at least read the section that starts us off with Manasseh, looking at Manasseh's reign. And Manasseh was the wicked king. Some have said concerning Manasseh, the way you can remember him is that Manasseh is to Judah as Ahab was to Israel. And so that's what we're looking at right now with Manasseh's reign. And so the first part we're getting into is this overview, and this is where we read through these verses and then kind of took a second and had some really good discussion thinking about with Manasseh kind of maybe what brought him into some of the wickedness that led him to where he was because of the age he was when he first became king, and then all the evil that followed, and thinking about the influences on him in his life, but also even thinking perhaps about some of the influence from King Hezekiah at the end of his life on Manasseh himself. But let's go ahead and read these verses again, get them back in our mind, and then we'll start kind of going through and breaking it down as we always try to do. So if somebody could, would you read 2 Kings chapter 21, verses 1 through 9.
Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king, and he reigned 55 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Hephzibah, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord, according to the abominations of the nations whom the Lord had cast out before the children of Israel. For he rebuilt the high places which Hezekiah his father had destroyed. He raised up altars for Baal and made a wooden image, as Ahab, king of Israel, had done. And he worshipped all the lost of heaven and served them. He also built altars in the house of the Lord, of which the Lord had said, in Jerusalem I will put my name. And he built altars for all the host of heaven in the two courts of the house of the Lord. Also he made his son pass through the fire, practiced soothsaying, used witchcraft, and consulted spiritists and mediums. He did much evil in the sight of the Lord to provoke him to anger. He even set a carved image of Asherah that he had made, in the house of which the Lord had said to David and to Solomon his son, in this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever, and I will not make the feet of Israel wander any more from the land which I gave their fathers. Only if they are careful to do according to all that I have commanded them, and according to all the law that my servant Moses commanded them. But they paid no attention, and Manasseh seduced them to do more evil than the nations whom the Lord had destroyed before the children of Israel.
I think I mentioned it last week when we read those verses, so if I did, then just bear with me, but if not, then good. Anyway, I think, like I say, I think that I mentioned, when we look at these verses here, this is really just a summary. But you look at this summary and you see all that Manasseh had done. I guess the question is, what did Manasseh not do? Because you look at this and you see all of these terrible, wicked things that Manasseh had done. What he did not do was the good things. At least this is what the Kings reveals for us. And so if this is just a summary, and this is just to kind of give a quick glimpse at the type of king and the type of man that Manasseh was, it doesn't take very much of reading into this to realize that Manasseh was very, 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 very wicked. So that's the type of man that we are dealing with in Manasseh. But if you go back up to verse 1 and you look at the start of this particular overview that's given of his reign, we see that Manasseh was pretty young when he became king. How old was he whenever he became king? 12 years old, right? 12 years old. Andy, how old is Ruger right now? 9. So imagine Ruger in 3 years. That's when Manasseh became king. Right? 12 years old. Now, obviously, at 12 years old, Manasseh is not going to be, he's obviously king. He's going to be face of the nation. But at 12 years old, he's not the one who's going to really be calling all of the shots. So you're going to have certain advisors in place. You're going to have some of who would have been Hezekiah's counselors who were there. But of course, when you look at the end of Hezekiah's life, while Hezekiah was a good king, and we saw that, the last little glimpse we get into Hezekiah is a problem with his pride. And so we don't really know how things ended for Hezekiah before his death, but we know there was at least that issue with pride. So there were some problems, at least within the nation. Of course, before Hezekiah came to power, there was still a lot of wickedness and idolatry that was going on. Hezekiah had gotten rid of a lot of that, but there still would have been certain traces that were left behind. And so now you have some of these type of people who are going to be trying to counsel and advise Manasseh. And Manasseh would have had a lot of good opportunity because at 12 years old, and he reigns for 55 years, he's got a lot of time to be king, right? He's king until he's 67, but he squandered pretty much all of that time. Manasseh could have done what was right, but sadly Manasseh did not use his time wisely. Now you keep looking in verse 1, and it tells us who his mother was. His mother's name was Hephzibah, and that's the only thing that we know about her. Hephzibah means my delight is in her. I always just kind of find it interesting moving through when you see the mention of who a particular king's mother was. I mean, of course, we know who their father is, but it's just interesting to me that the little glimpses we get into who their mother was. Sometimes there's more that we know about them than others, but nonetheless, Hephzibah was the mother of Manasseh. And then archaeologically speaking, this here is a seal that would have been one of Manasseh's seals that has been found. Of course, the seal is what's used to authorize and be the signet ring and things like that on whatever might go out to show that it is in fact from the king. So that's a seal that has been found that does trace back to Manasseh. And so that's just something historically, archaeologically for you there. Now, going through the overview, you get to verse 2. And in verse 2, as Benjamin read for us just a minute ago, you see the type of reign that Manasseh had. He was not a good king, but instead Manasseh did what in the sight of the Lord? He did evil. He was not like Hezekiah. And of course, when you look at Hezekiah, you see that Hezekiah did a lot of really good things in his reign and overall is characterized as a good king. And thinking back to the start of Hezekiah's reign, who did Hezekiah model himself after? Not Isaiah, but think about who the king in Judah was. The king in Israel. David. You look back at the start of Hezekiah's reign and it tells us that Hezekiah was one who followed in the ways of David. But now you look at Manasseh, and who is Manasseh modeling himself after? He's modeling himself after the pagans, right? After all the nations who were around him. You look at the way that the evil comes about, and it says, according to the abominations of the nations, whom the Lord cast out before the children of Israel. So it's not just that he's trying to be like the nations, but he wants to be like the worst of these nations. The abominations of the nations. There's some good rhyming for you and all of that. Yeah, that's a rhyme, right? I'm questioning myself now. Yes. Abominations of the nations. Abominations of the nations. There we go. So with Manasseh, we see, of course, just how wicked he was. You think about with all of this then, the importance of influence. And we talked a little bit about this, if I remember right, in some of our discussion at the end of class last week. Think about the influences that Hezekiah wanted to have. Hezekiah would have been looking back in history and trying to look at the good. And of course, if he's going to model his ways after David, then he's going to ultimately be trying to be a man after God's own heart, because that's who David was, a man after God's heart. So Hezekiah was taking the right influences and putting them in his life. But then you look at Manasseh. What type of influences was Manasseh going after? The worst kind of influences. I wonder, what history is he reading? Who is he looking up to? Who does he want to become? And of course we know he wants to become like the abominations of the nations around them, whom the Lord had cast out. There's a reason the Lord had cast them out, but Manasseh did not care at all about that. Manasseh had these bad influences in his life, but hopefully something we can take and think about from this is to realize that our influences matter. Who are we letting influence us? Now, no matter who we are, we have someone or something that influences us. We may be more of a leader than a follower. That's just going to be, the way it is for some. Some are going to be more of a follower than a leader. But even those who are more leaders than followers still have something or someone that influences them. What is it? Who is it? The influence itself may not be an abomination of the nations whom the Lord cast out, may not be the worst of the worst, but that influence may not be an influence that is actually pushing us to be better, that is urging us to do better and to strengthen ourselves and to work continually to examine our own life and to make sure that we're getting rid of those things that need to be gotten rid of instead of bringing those abominations back in. We have to think about who our influences are. But also going back to some of what Geraldine had brought up at the end of class last week, thinking about the influences that we leave behind for our children. Manasseh is 12 years old when he becomes king. Manasseh is going to be relying on the advisors that were there whenever his father was no longer king. So he's going to be using the same advisors, the same counselors, but what if those advisors and counselors were not the best influence on Manasseh? You look at everything that Manasseh did in his life, and you start to realize and you start to see that the wickedness is not something that happened at the end, but the wickedness began early on and just continued to build and grow. Who did Hezekiah leave behind as influences for his son? What type of influences are we leaving behind for our children? Or are we leaving behind for our grandchildren? Hezekiah was a good king. We may be good people. But if we're not thinking about our influence, if we're not thinking about who's influencing us, if we're not thinking about the type of influences that we want to leave behind for our children or our grandchildren, then realize our children or our grandchildren may become more like Manasseh. And so we have to make sure that we consider these things. Because then the Kings goes on in this overview to tell us this summary about Manasseh's reign. In verse 6, in the midst of verse 6, it tells us concerning Manasseh that he did much evil in the sight of the Lord to provoke him to anger. And so thinking about this much evil that would provoke the Lord to anger, what are some of the things, what is it that we see listed in this section here that Manasseh had done?
Sacrificed his son.
All right, so you have the fact that he sacrificed his son. He sacrificed his children, making them pass through the fire. What else do we see?
He restored the high temples and
Yeah.
kingdoms and the pillars and all that.
Yeah, he brought back the idol worship. He brought back the high places and was bringing in altars and things even into the temple, right? He went even beyond the high places and was bringing it into the house of God. What else do we see?
I take note, he practiced soothsaying, used witchcraft, consulted spiritists and mediums. He's doing that of which it is the Lord
Yes.
is against.
Yes. He should have been looking to the Lord, but instead, like you say, he's practicing soothsaying and he's going to mediums and spiritists and witchcraft, all of these sorts of things that are showing he's doing everything possible that he can against God.
And again, he's supposed to, being king, he's supposed to have the best interest of the people in mind. While he's, practicing all of it.
Yes. And so, all right, so you bring that up there with the king.
Sacrilege.
He's supposed to have the best interest of the people. And what do the people end up doing?
Well, they're going to act out too.
They act out just like him. They follow his lead, right? A leader leads the people follow the leader. The people are going to follow the king. There is a lot of application that we can take as we work through a lot of this together. So thinking about Manasseh, you look in verse 3 and just working through it verse by verse in it. Verse 3 starts out right where Chris started. to realize that Manasseh restored the high places. He restored these high places that Hezekiah had destroyed. His father tore them down. His father got rid of them, but Manasseh brings them back. Most likely, Manasseh has somebody in his ear saying, we need to bring it back. We need to bring it back. We need to bring it back. Maybe it's the history that Manasseh was learning about the nations around him, that maybe it's something he learned in the process of these things about the great conquests of perhaps the Assyrians. Maybe he saw how the Assyrians got to be so great and how the Assyrians took out their neighbors to the north. And maybe it's because of the strength that he read about the Assyrian gods who really were not gods. So perhaps Manasseh is thinking, well, if I can build the high places, I can get them on my side. So you see that he's restoring these things back. Beyond the high places, it tells us in verse 3, he restored Baal worship. It tells us in verse 3 that he made his own idols. But who is it also that we see, and who's the example that's given? Who else in the past had made their own idols? Ahab. Like we mentioned earlier, Manasseh is to Judah as Ahab was to Israel, following right in those footsteps. Kason?
I know it's jumping ahead a little bit, but it is interesting looking at from a perspective of even with all the good that Hezekiah did, his son Manasseh and even Manasseh's son become evil kings, and then despite how evil they are, the next king's son, Josiah, is even younger, and he's a fantastic king. And so it just goes, it's important for us to give good examples to our children, of course, but it does go to show you that sometimes no matter how much you try, some people just choose wrong, and then sometimes no matter how much evil someone is taught, they end up choosing good. So there's a kind of a little bit of good and bad with that. But.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll get into it some once we get to at least to Ammon in the next section here in this particular chapter, because what we're going to find is there's something we learn in the Chronicles about Manasseh that the Kings doesn't reveal at the end of Manasseh's life. But it's one of those things where Manasseh had already shown so much influence that it was going to be too late for Ammon to follow the good that might be seen at the very end. But yeah, like you say, to realize it can go from good to bad to then Josiah turns it around. And Josiah is, like you say, a great king. And we'll get into Josiah in chapter 22. So Manasseh, we're seeing, the wickedness that he had done. He's restored the high places, restored Baal worship. He's made his own idols. Then you get to the end of verse 3, and there's all of this idolatrous spiritualism that Manasseh is bringing in. Then you get into verses 4 and 5, and you see the way that he desecrated the temple. Same things are going to come up in verses 7 and 8, and sort of where God had made these promises. And the temple, of course, was understood as the house of God. It's where the mercy seat was, where God would come to dwell among his people. But nonetheless, Manasseh doesn't care anything about it. Manasseh's bringing in all of these altars, and he's making these offerings there to, the text says, all the host of heaven. It was something that was understood at that time that the stars, like the way that the pagans at the time saw the stars in the sky, was that the stars were like mediators between the men and the gods. So you look out and you see all the stars. You cannot begin to count all of the stars. But the way that the pagans went about it is we need to do something and make these offerings to all of these stars, to all the hosts of heaven. Right? You think about it sometimes, and perhaps when we start to think about idolatry, a lot of times maybe we think about the big idols, and we think about Baal, or we think about Asherah, who we read about even here with Manasseh. Maybe we think about Molech whenever it is that they would pass their sons through the fire to Molech. And so you think about some of these big names, but don't forget in the midst of all of it that there were all sorts of idols. All the hosts of heaven, all the stars, that's everyone that they're trying to worship. You see just how far it's gone from understanding, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And so they have gone so far away. As it was mentioned in verse 6, you see where it is that Manasseh practices child sacrifice, and he practices all sorts of sorcery. And then to top it all off in verse 9, It tells us concerning Manasseh that he seduced the people of God to do more evil than the nations whom the Lord had destroyed before the children of Israel. To think about everything that he had done. Perhaps the worst among it all is the fact that he influenced the people to follow him in his wickedness. Think about the value of good leadership. We'll talk about that some more here in just a second, but I saw David's hand and then Geraldine.
Well, because of his young age, and I know he's getting older because he's had a son, but because of his young age, early on, I don't think he was doing all of this on his own.
Mm-hmm.
He had some evil advisors at his ear, and he was trying to please them. So he was doing everything that they wanted to do. Just, it was blamed on him, but it's their fault for being so evil.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, Manasseh had a say in it. He could have done the opposite, but instead he went right along with it. And like we said, it's something that is just going to grow and compound over time. And you see just how wicked he was. I mean, even to that point of being willing to sacrifice his own sons. How far do you have to be from where you ought to be okay with doing that?
That's sick.
It's hard to fathom, but so many did it at that time. And of course, we can stop and think of some parallels and realize people do it today. They may not pass their children through the fire, but a lot of times, I think we mentioned it in some previous classes, parents will sacrifice their children to the God of education, to the God of sports, to the God of whatever it may be, and pass their children through that fire. And a lot of times, sadly, the children may not come back from it. But we don't always see it in the same way because it's not the actual fire that you're putting your children into. But it shows just how far and how, it's possible to get there. Geraldine and then Brandy.
I was just curious in verse 6 where it says practice soothsaying. I know you said that was all kind of witchcraft, and what was that exactly? Was that like casting spells or something? Or
Yeah, so some of the things that would be done, and I'm trying to think back now to which king it was. I want to say, well, off the top of my head, I don't remember exactly which king, but one of the previous kings in Judah, it talked about how they had gone to Syria, they had gone to Damascus, and they saw an altar there, brought it back, built it, and then they practiced. Basically what they practiced on it was they would take like animal entrails and offer them up and then kind of like inspect them. And so it was like a way that they would look at it and try to kind of like see into the future or try to get some word from the gods or something like that. So that's going to be at least a part of the soothsaying. Some of it might be the idea that they're casting these spells and things like that. I know a lot of times with the witchcraft or sorcery, sometimes when that comes up, that would have dealt with even kind of like drug use and things like that to try and put one in a state where they're not in a state where there are certain things coming into the mind where the thought is it's coming from the gods. You would have as well like the spiritists. That's the type of thing, and the mediums where they're like trying to conjure up the ghosts and things like that to speak to the spirits. So there's a lot when you start getting into it.
Like, why would you even want to do that?
And to think about the fact back to who was it that mentioned Ben when Ben mentioned about with how the fact that he should have been going to God in all of these things, right? The purpose that he's doing all of that is to try to see who are my enemies. Are they going to come attack, right? And kind of magic 8-ball. Should I do it now? That kind of a thing. And all the while, he should have been going to God. And one of the things that we're going to notice in a second is the fact that through all of this, God kept sending his word to the people through the prophets, but no one was listening. Nobody cared. They'd rather try to do it in their own creepy kind of way. And sadly, that's what's going on. Let me get Brandy, and then I'll come to you.
It kind of
goes back to what David was saying, you know, with the advisors and counselors that he had, to make a parallel for us today, that just goes to show why each congregation needs such a sound, solid eldership that is involved with their congregation to help be that good and holy influence and make sure that the flock that they're overseeing is keeping to their influence, because their influence is they're trying to mimic as closely to God as they possibly can.
Yeah, absolutely. Leadership greatly matters, and I'll come back to you in a second, Ben. But that kind of works me into the next thought that I had here, thinking about Manasseh, thinking about his influence, thinking about his leadership and the way that he led all of these people astray, because Manasseh even himself was led in that particular way. But to realize with his leadership that he seduced the people to do more evil, the text says in verse 9, to do more evil than the nations whom the Lord had destroyed before the children of Israel. How far had the children of Israel gone? They were more of an abomination than the abomination of the nations whom the Lord had cast out. That's God's own people. Would anybody ever stop and say, well, God's people were the worst people that there ever were? But what does God say? His own children had reached that point. Is it possible for us to potentially reach that point as well?
Yes.
Well, how do we get there if the leadership isn't leading us in the right way? What should the people have done? When Manasseh starts seducing them and leading them away, what should the people have done? They should have stood up. They should have gone to God. They should have listened to the prophets. They should have turned things around. They should have refused to follow in that wickedness. But instead, the people, it says, paid no attention and allowed themselves to be seduced to do the same evils and to become worse than the nations around them. But thinking about application for us, and this goes to Brandy's thought as it relates to the importance of having a good eldership and a strong and a solid eldership. What are we supposed to do whenever we have our own Manasseh or Manassehs thinking about the eldership within the church?
Hold them accountable.
We need to stand up for what's right. We need to be able to know the truth well enough to follow that truth, to be able to recognize, perhaps even before that individual may get themselves in a position of leadership, that that's not going to happen. But if it does happen, to understand the Scriptures provide us a way to know how we are to do that, how we are to work with that. We have to make sure that we are careful in who it is that is leading the way, because as the leaders go, so go the people. If the leader himself or the leadership as a whole is not what it ought to be, the church itself may do okay for a little while, but before too long, the church is going to start to follow that lead. You may have some good individuals within the congregation who are holding the line, who are doing what's right, who are trying to teach the truth and all of these things, but as soon as that generation, as soon as the Hezekiah in the generation dies out, then realize where everybody's going to start to go. It's easy for us at times, and I know I've said this more than once, it's easy for us at times to think about everybody outside of these walls, to think about everybody outside of the church. But we have to realize what it is for us inside, and just how the children of God there in Judah had become worse than all the other nations. If we're not careful, we as the body can become worse ourselves. We have to make sure that we have the leadership that we need, the leadership is doing the right thing, and that we as the body ourselves are not just blindly following. That we know the Scriptures ourselves, that we know the truth, that we're following in that, doing the right thing ourselves. Leadership matters. I better get Ben, and then I'll come Jesse, and then work my way back over here.
Just want to add on that verse 6 about the soothsaying and all. I referred back to Deuteronomy 18, 10 through 14, where it just goes over that account, avoid wicked custom.
Right.
And of course, that's just what I found.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, throughout the law of Moses, you see the law stating that we're not to follow in that. We're not to act in that way. We're not to do it that way. And here we see Manasseh was doing it that way and then some, right? Trying every way he could. If there was a law in the law of Moses that said not to do it, chances are Manasseh did it.
That's kind of like the Ten Commandments, you know.
Mm-hmm.
There's still lots of law-abiding citizens who obey the Ten Commandments.
Mm-hmm.
That may be their only source of faith.
But there's more to it, right?
Right.
More to it than
More
that.
to the salvation of our souls.
Right. We've got to stick to what it is that has been revealed for us and follow in the ways of Jesus, right? Absolutely. Jesse? Ahaz. Yes, thank you for that. Yes.
It says verse 15 that he inquired, he built a new altar, and he used the old altar for his soothsaying.
Yes, thank you. Jesse went back and found that reference I was trying to think of earlier, Geraldine, with the other king who had built that altar, and it was King Ahaz, and you said chapter 16, verse 15. Chapter 16, verse 15 is where we see on that altar he had built. He built a new altar and then used the old altar to practice kind of the divination and soothsaying and all those sorts of things. And so, like I say, it was something we'd seen in the past, and now Manasseh's just like ramping it up. I think Aaron, and then Johnny, and then Paul, and then Geraldine.
Well, this goes back to, but they paid no attention to Manasseh, seduced them to do more evil than the nations whom the Lord had destroyed before the children of Israel. And this just goes back to when God gives us commands to follow it all the way through, because this is why he told them to wipe them off the face of the earth, all of those nations and people around them, because he knew this was going to happen. And if we allow the models in life, if we look up to the people in life that are doing evil, what are we going to do?
We're going to start doing evil.
And so, we have to, the same as God wanted them to rid all that out of their life, we have to do that to our lives too. If you have people that are questionable of integrity and questionable about, like, you got to get them out of your life. Because eventually, what is that saying? You hang out in the barbershop long enough, you're going to get a haircut. You hang around people long enough that are questionable integrity, you're going to fall into that too. And so for us, we must flee from evil and guard, we have to guard who we put ourselves around, and the people that are that influence.
Well, and even thinking about how they paid no attention, I wonder if maybe at the very start of Manasseh's reign, maybe when there were some things that started to become more visible and that were much more of a open thing that Manasseh had been doing, that you maybe had some people who were like, this, I don't know that we need to be doing this. And you probably have others around them who are saying, hey, just slow down, right? It's not that big of a deal. It could be that he's doing this. Well, then you get a little bit further down the road. Now there's another thing added and another thing added. And you keep saying, well, it's, maybe he shouldn't, but it's not as bad as this. Now he gets to that. But the conscience has reached a point where that's not so bad anymore. Have to be careful in all those things. All right, Johnny, and then if I have time, then Paul, and then Geraldine.
Remember, King Saul, he had banned under penalty of death these witches and mediums and stuff. Then he turns around and goes to
The Witch of Endor, right? Yeah. And he was doing that himself.
It's still like Christ said about the Jewish leaders in his day. It was lion leading the blind.
And they'll fall into the ditch. Right, the people are going to follow whoever the leaders are, so you got to make sure you got the right ones. Paul?
Throughout history, mankind has always, because of their non-belief in the one God, that one God has rules. He has things that we are to be responsible to. Take that away, mankind wants to be their own God. They only want to be responsible to themselves. And if that's the case, and that's the way you live your life, then there are no rules.
Yeah.
And so Baal, for example, you create Baal. Well, what are the rules of Baal? There are none. You don't have to be responsible to Baal because there are no rules that he's established as to believe in something.
Yeah, and then whatever you don't like from Baal, you go to Asherah. If you don't like it from Asherah, you go to all the hosts and the stars in the heaven, right? You just keep going on and you just keep making it whatever you want it to be, right? To your point, to realize if it's not Jehovah God, if it's not the Lord God that we're following, then we're really just following self.
So if you build something, that's another form of pride where you say, okay, well, I'm going to fashion something, look what I did, look what I created. And Jehovah says, well, you know, if he asked to build an altar, it had nothing to do with what it looked like, whether it was made out of gold or it was made out of rock. It was the point that he gave us instruction to see if we would follow and be obedient. That was it. It had nothing to do with the material that it was made out of.
Yeah, he's always been a God of structure, a God of order, a God of pattern. That it's not chaotic to follow him. That there's always, like you say, that instruction that we follow. And clearly Manasseh is not following the instruction. And he leads the people to where they're not following it either. And the only way the people are going to follow it is if the example is shown. There's a reason, going back to Deuteronomy 6, that it starts with the parents at home, that parents teach it to your children, but the parents have to first know it and follow it and do it themselves. Well, Manasseh had overall a good example in Hezekiah, but then at 12, whenever Hezekiah dies, the influence that's left to him after that is people saying, I don't want to follow the rules of God. I want to do it my way. Let's do it how we think, how we feel it should be done.
So what people do is they're followers, and they follow to whatever level of responsibility they want to be. If I show up today to a particular gathering on a Sunday morning, on Christmas, it may be on Easter, you know, well, what if I miss Easter? Well, my hope is that the people that I think I'm responsible to at that congregation won't say, hey, where were you? You didn't show up at Christmas and you didn't show up at Easter. But if they leave you alone, well, that's even less responsibility. They think that meets their requirement. Or it's their, whatever they, in their mind, is good enough.
There's no accountability in it.
Accountability.
And the people weren't, in Manasseh's day, the people weren't holding him accountable. And, you know, if we don't hold our leadership accountable, where may our leadership go? But at the same time, understand, if our leadership is not holding us accountable, where might we be going as well? It all matters. Geraldine, I've got 10:14, so there's some time.
I was just kind of actually about to add on to what, I was just going to answer the question that you had up and just kind of what you just said about leadership. I also feel like that's just a really good lesson about respecting our elders and their church discipline. I feel like a lot of times members will leave congregations because, well, the eldership is just a little too hard and the eldership is a little too on us, a little too, well, I mean, if they're not doing their job, then, I mean, A, they're not doing what God strictly commanded them, but also you have this. So, I mean, I just think that people sometimes think, well, that's just a little extreme, you're just being a little too much. Well, if not, then the congregation's just only going to deteriorate because nobody's being held accountable for sinning, even if it's not, I mean, all sin is measured equally, so even if it's just so-and-so doing this outside of here, whatever.
Well, it's, what is it, 1 Corinthians 5, where we see in a context there of church discipline, the idea of how a little leaven leavens the whole lump. But I think as well, back to Aaron, what you had brought up, thinking about the fact that the Lord had cast all of these nations out. And so, Geraldine, connecting with your thought, even on church discipline, there's a reason why the nations had to be cast out. There's a reason why church discipline is in place, because if you pay it no attention, right, and this is a little bit of a different concept here, not so much the leadership. Well, if the leadership pays the sin among the membership no attention, then eventually that sin is going to grow. One's going to lead to the next. Now it's going to start to impact others, and it's going to keep growing to a point that now you're no better than, you know, anywhere else, right? That you've become even worse, thinking about it in the way that God saw his people in that day and time. And so obviously a lot of application we can make. So that gets us through this overview of Manasseh, and then Lord willing next week, hi Maggie. Lord willing, next week we'll pick up in the next section and look at the Lord's judgment.